Okay. Now, governance and policy making. What do we mean? I mean, we'll first talk about the British Constitution. But when we talk about the British Constitution, what do we mean? Do we have one single document that says, a text, a single formal document that says, okay, this is the British Constitution? Do we have that? No, we don't have that. There is no one single formal text which is above ordinary law. But we have a combination of all kinds of texts, different types of texts, written statutory law, case-based common law, convention, authoritative interpretations, past interpretations of legislation, and also habit, customary law. Okay, so all of these really form the backbones of the British Constitution, so-called. So there is no single unified text. There's no one single unified text that is above, that stands above ordinary law. Okay? So the Constitution defines, defines the powers of the Parliament, the relationship between the Crown and the Parliament, okay? And the relationship between the state vis-a-vis its citizens. So the relationship between the state and citizens. So it is in that respect a functioning constitution. But when we refer to the British Constitution, there is no one single document, no formal one single text. So it's form-wise, in terms of its form, it's quite unique. It's quite atypical, let me put it that way. In terms of its date, it's quite unique. In that respect, it's antique. So it goes back to the Bill of Rights of 17th century. So the Bill of Rights plus an act declaring the rights and liberties of the subject and settling the succession of the crown. So the Bill of Rights, 1689, really constitutes a key element of what's called the British, what we refer to as the British Constitution. It is a striking combination of texts. In its spirit, it incorporates hereditary institutions. And by hereditary institutions, we mean two. So not only the Crown, the Queen now, but also the House of Lords. So House of Lords as well as the Crown. And in that respect, or in those respects, it is a flexible constitution. It is not a rigid constitution, because there are few absolute principles of governance in the Constitution. The Parliament still has considerable powers, and the Parliament is not bound by a constitutional review. Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is it for the Constitution. What about the organization of the state? The British model of state is known as the Westminster model, which is comprised of parliamentary sovereignty, or the elements of which are parliamentary sovereignty, parliamentary democracy, and cabinet government. So parliamentary sovereignty, parliamentary democracy, and cabinet government. What do we mean by each of these? By parliamentary sovereignty, the parliament is unrestricted in terms of its legislative powers. It is unrestricted by the executive, by the judiciary, as well as the crown. It is unrestricted from or by the judiciary. It's not restricted by the judiciary because there is no constitutional court that says, hey, you can't do that. Okay? So there is no constitutional review possible in this system. It is not restricted by the crown because the crown does not have a say like, I veto this. Okay? So the crown does not act as a veto player in the system. So neither the judiciary nor the crown can repeal a law or can send back an act or a legislation that is passed by the parliament. And the executive is part and parcel of the parliament. So in that respect, it is the executive that answers to the parliament. So as you can see, this is an institution, the parliament, which is in a way supreme, okay, among the branches of government. So the parliament can make and overturn any law it wishes, and there is no veto or constitutional review. One set of limitations on parliament, on British parliamentary sovereignty, was imposed by the EU. The acquis communautaire. Do we know what acquis communautaire means? Acquis communautaire. It's all the treaties, all the legislations, all the international treaties that the EU had been amassing, all the directives, all the judgments, rulings by the European Court of Justice. So all court decisions and all others. So parliamentary sovereignty had been limited by EU legislation, by the EU's acquis communautaire. But aside from that, there was no other law that was above and beyond what the parliament was making. So except for the EU, parliamentary sovereignty was in a way absolute. Okay? But now that's going to be changing soon with the Brexit. So parliamentary sovereignty was the first element. The second element of the Westminster model is parliamentary democracy. What we mean here is that the Prime Minister, the Premier, is answerable to the House of Commons, the lower house in the Parliament, which is popularly elected, or members of which are popularly elected, and the Prime Minister may be dismissed by the Parliament. So he is answerable to the Parliament, or she is answerable to the Parliament, and she is also, or she may be dismissed by the House of Commons, the lower house in the Parliament. A third element of the Westminster model is cabinet government, which has something to do with fusion of powers. By fusion of powers, we mean the Parliament is the supreme organ of the state because it really entails legislative powers, or it monopolizes legislative powers. It shares executive powers. It also shares judicial authority. And it may include the monarch in the parliament, the queen in parliament. And it also incorporates the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Lords and the monarch are the hereditary institutions. So it really amasses all power in the system, which really attests to the constitutional monarchy as the name of the regime denotes. The cabinet government, what we refer to as cabinet government here, is that members of the cabinet are collectively responsible. Members of the cabinet are members of parliament, and they are collectively responsible. There is no independent premier, but in time, there has been strengthening of the core executive. But what's important here, both the legislature, well, it is the parliament, and the executive are part and parcel of the parliament. Okay, so both of these powers are part and parcel, or are under the legislature, the parliamentary. So cabinet government means that it makes decisions collectively, and it is collectively responsible to the parliament. Okay, so that's important to remember, the Westminster model. What does the British executive look like? When we talk about the British executive, we start with the cabinet government. Here we have key functions of the ministers. How does the government, or how is the government formed after the elections? The crown, the monarch, the queen in this case, invites the chief of the party, head of the party, leader of the party, which has got the largest number of seats in the House of Commons, and then appoints that person as the prime minister and asks to form a cabinet. So that's how the cabinet is formed. The key functions of the cabinet is that the cabinet is involved in policy making. It controls the government. It amasses executive power or executive powers, and it coordinates between departments, different departments that make up the executive. In principle, we have about 22 to 24 ministers that make up the cabinet. What's important here is that the cabinet members, the cabinet itself, has constitutional standing, meaning that they have constitutional privileges. So this is in contrast to the US case, where the president is, yes, it is in the Constitution, the presidency, but his cabinet has much less of a constitutional standing than it is the case in Britain. So it enjoys constitutional privileges. And among these ministers, we've got the prime minister as the head of the core executive. And in general, the most powerful ministries are Foreign Office, Home Office, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is basically standing for Minister of Finance or Ministry of Finance. Okay, so core powers with formal constitutional privileges. Once again, the cabinet is collectively responsible in the sense that they are collectively answerable to the parliament. But from the 1990s onwards, there has been a trend towards strengthening of the core executive within the cabinet. Okay, so some members in the cabinet, such as the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, as well as the Chancellor, Minister of Finance, that is, with their own private advisors, they really form the core of cabinet, they really make a lot of decisions on day-to-day functioning of the state, of the government. Part of the executive is bureaucracy. We tend to forget that the bureaucracy is part and parcel of the executive. It is an instrument, it is the instrument of executive power. So by bureaucracy, we mean unelected officials, servicemen and women that share collectively executive powers with the government. So they share executive powers with the cabinet. We see this is Whitehall, Parliament Street, Downing Street, number 10, so Cabinet Office. So as you can see, this is the executive, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Treasury, Ministry of Defense, part of the military. So basically around Department of Work and Pensions, Department of Health. So around Whitehall Avenue, you see government offices, ministries, executive buildings. This reminds you of Ankara's which district, which area? Where bakanlıklar is, okay? And part of Kızılay, right? So imagine a large avenue on both sides of which you've got ministries scattered. So in each of these ministries, we've got a permanent secretary running a ministry. He is the top civil servant. Like in the Turkish system, we have the undersecretary, okay? Permanent secretary, plus the minister's principal private secretary, which is appointed by the minister to basically liaise with the civil servants from tip to toe. From the 1980s onwards, the role of bureaucracy has been eroding, but especially in the British culture, we have a pluralist system of policy making. Bureaucracy had major functions in informing policymakers, in designing policies, in refining policies, and also in implementing legislation. So the British Whitehall culture has always been very important in running the government, running the entire system. But from the 1980s onwards, things have been changing. Rolling back the state had ramifications for political life in terms of the executive. The size of the British executive, British bureaucracy had been contracting because of economizing, because of rolling back the state and other strategies. Members of the executive, civil servants, are increasingly on temporary contracts as opposed to long-term contracts. So there are, from the 1980s onwards, temporary contracts have been quite prevalent in the public sector. The ministries now look more like corporate structures with their own human resource management departments and all other departments that really mimic what looks like a corporation, large-scale corporation. And perhaps what's important, there has been an increasing trend towards politicization of bureaucracy, of the administration, which mean that you're really subjecting Whitehall to ministerial control. So ministries or ministers really say the last word in terms of recruitment and retention, appointments and all that. So the old order that had been institutionalized under the British state tradition had been changing, which brought with it problems for the bureaucracy in terms of their centralization or centralized state, centralization of the British executive is being impaired. But also their impartiality is being increasingly questioned after these reforms. So this is what Whitehall culture implies, and this is what Whitehall represents. Parts of the executive are very interesting institutions called Quangos. But there's also nationalized industries. Let me talk about nationalized industries first, especially during post-war collectivist era. Some industries, from mining to military services, they were nationalized, they were collectivized, and there were state economic enterprises, state-owned enterprises, state-operated enterprises. They have been changing in terms of their control. From 1980s onwards, we see privatization processes under Thatcher. It starts with Thatcher. It continues throughout the 2000s too. But what's important here is that there has been denationalization, read privatization of these industries. Another part of the executive are the Quangos. These are quasi-autonomous NGOs, and NGOs stand for non-governmental organizations. They receive funding from the government, but they're quite independent of the ministries. So they do receive funding from the government, but they run not within the auspices of the ministries. They, in a way, combine government as well as private enterprise. One example is local arts councils. They are on a short leash by the government, in the sense that they're funded by the government, but what they do, they're really independent of the ministries, independent of what the government wants. Other state institutions, in addition to the bureaucracy, we have the military as well as the police. The military, the British military has been known for its professionalism. From Thatcher's era, it has been increasingly used to project power. Some of you may remember from some of your courses or your history books the Falkland Islands War. Imagine Britain coming all the way to South America on the coast of Argentina and making war, fighting Argentinian fleet. So the military has been increasingly used under Thatcher to really purport to project British power, which led to a decline in its popularity in time. When you look at the police, it's basically a combination of independent local forces. In time, government's control over the police had been increasing, again, under Thatcher. Centralization had been there, but also we see elements of politicization by the government of the police. So again, this politicization really had been discussed publicly, starting off with the late 1980s, but there is, it comes to the agenda from time to time, political agenda from time to time. When we look at the British judiciary, there is no constitutional court, as I've said, as I've mentioned. That means that there is no power to judge the constitutionality of the legislation passed by the Parliament. So there's no option of constitutional review in this system. So what the Parliament does, in a way, because it is supreme, in a way cannot be repealed or challenged by another institution. Also, jurists participate in royal commissions, public inquiries, and that means they're also being part and parcel of the policymaking process. When we look at subnational government, we see, yes, Britain is one of the examples of a unitary state. It had been more centralized. I mean, not all unitary states are very centralized. By centralization, I have at the back of my mind the country we live in, but also countries like France. But in British case, it looked more like a centralized country, but over time, there has been what's called devolution, decentralization of power away from the center toward the legislatures, legislative bodies in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So there has been some decentralization from the late 1990s onwards, especially under Blair government. There has been what we call devolution or devolution of powers away from the central government to these subnational units. Local governments have no formal administrative powers, but they do have some financial and policy discretion. What's important here is that when you really take a bird's eye view of the British policymaking process, you see that it is more of a Whitehall culture as opposed to a Westminster culture. Yes, legislation takes place in the legislature, so you may think that it is the Westminster system that dominates day-to-day policymaking, policies, practices, but because of its weight in the system, bureaucracy, Whitehall informs, refines, help design, as well as implement policies. So bureaucracy is not just a simple implementing apparatus. It informs, refines, and helps design policies. In that respect, it really shares some of the powers with the Parliament in terms of day-to-day policy making in the British case. And we see the influence of policy committees in the Parliament. There are many committees in the Parliament, parliamentary committees. We call them, in this country, parliamentary commissions. In the British case, they're known as policy committees. And when you look at the entire system, these are mostly insider-only systems. Or this is an example of an insider-only system. In that, yes, policy is not, or policy-making process is not really insulated from interest group participation. It is, in that respect, a pluralist policy-making type or national policy style type in terms of policy-making practices or policy traditions or administrative traditions. But when you are talking about policy-making processes, decision-making, it's quite an insulated process where you have established insiders who are part and parcel of either the executive or the legislature, or you're really outside of the system. So in that respect, we can talk about an insider-only process. Europeanization of policy making had been there since the 1970s, early 1970s. We see the importance of then EC, now EU, in policy making because of the principle of direct effect. If the EU comes up with a decision, either through its court system or through its treaties, it takes direct effect at the level of the member states. That means the policymaking process is really being shaped on a daily basis by Brussels. Okay, and all of this is unraveling before our eyes. We will be witnessing the first case of a withdrawal out of the EU with the Brexit. There has always been, remember in the first class when we talked about Britain, British ideology, Britishness, British identity really complicates Britain's relationships with the EU, with the member states of the EU as well as the EU. And it really culminated in the Brexit decision. But what's important is that policymaking had been increasingly Europeanized. Whether Britain's exit will mean de-Europeanization, we'll see how it happens. It'll be very experimental for us all. Then comes representation and participation. We can talk about the legislature. We know that parliamentary sovereignty is important, but parliamentary sovereignty in practice, de jure sovereignty, is really limited. The executive may at times dominate the legislature because the executive naturally comes out of the legislature in this system, but the executive may really dominate the day-to-day functioning of the legislature by imposing its agenda on the legislature. How does the legislative process work? Bills are first introduced in the House of Commons, in the lower house. Then they are also introduced in the House of Lords. There are 3 readings in the House of Lords, and there are also 3 readings in the House of Commons, and then followed by a repeating of the system of this practice in the House of Lords. And then if both houses of the Parliament pass this piece of legislation, it is sent to royal assent. And then the Crown promulgates the legislation. What's important here is that it is the House of Commons that we see as the democratic institution. The House of Lords, therefore, does not tinker with the acquired rights that have been acquired centuries ago. And that has everything to do with taxation and budgets. So the House of Lords, as a hereditary system or as a hereditary institution, does not really play with or has no authority to play with legislation related to the budget and taxes. So it refrains from playing with these or participating in these processes because of the fact that it is a hereditary institution, and from the 16th century onwards, the Parliament and the hereditary institutions, there has been a dividing line in terms of, taxation and budgets. So it is in that respect, in the tradition, in the old British tradition of division of powers with respect to who does what. Okay, so the House of Lords passes the budget law as well as all legislation on taxation without any amendments. So it just, all of these really pass without any amendments, without any changes introduced in the system. Let me quickly talk about how the legislature is formed. We have, as I mentioned, two chambers in the Parliament: the House of Commons, the lower house, which is the which is composed of democratically elected officials. It has many functions: to pass legislation, to pass laws. They make drafts, bills or legislation. They authorize taxation. And also the House of Commons reviews public administration. And the interesting thing is that the legislative function of the Parliament is really limited in the face of a strengthening executive. So there has been a trend among advanced industrialized countries in general, and Britain in particular, from the 1980s onwards, towards strengthening of the executives dominating the legislatures. Yes, we do live in the age of democracy, but we see, or we witness, strengthening of the executive vis-a-vis the legislature. So that's also important to remember. House of Lords, these are unelected members, and they are composed of hereditary peers, law lords, life peers, and archbishops. And in some cases, the House of Lords serve as the final court of appeal in certain areas. What they can do in the legislative process, they can't really veto anything, but they can amend legislation or they can delay legislation. So once a piece of legislation is brought to the agenda of the House of Commons, and if the House of Commons passes that legislation after 3 readings, then it is read 3 times in the House of Lords. And here, what the House of Lords can do is that they can only amend, change, that is, parts of the legislation, or they can delay discussing, debating the legislation so that it takes longer for that piece of legislation to be able to be sent to royal assent. So for a bill to be passed in both houses, because of that process, the House of Lords may delay that process or has the capacity to delay that process. Once the legislation is passed in both houses, the House of Lords, because they are very well versed in law, matters of law, they clean the legislation. They standardize the legislation that would make it more uniform across all existing legislations. I think we can complete our discussion here. We have the quiz on Friday. Once again, the quiz will cover all the material we've covered under Part 1. You have these 3 readings, these ones, okay? And you have the lectures. So you're responsible for all the material. The quiz will be, once again, I may have announced this, Gesundheit. The quiz will have some questions. There may be some choice. It'll take about half an hour. So you'll have to organize your ideas, bring your ideas and organize your ideas carefully and quickly. It'll be somewhere in between short answer and short essay. So they're not essays, the answers, but they're not short definition-like answers. Okay? So please.
That quiz cover today's lecture?
The quiz will cover only the material we've covered in Part 1. That is to say, the modern state, well, comparative politics in general, the modern state, democracy, excuse me, what democracy is not, the procedures and the outcomes, as well as models of democracy. Okay, so only those materials that we've covered under Part 1. All the material we've been covering for the past 2-3 lectures will be covered in the midterm. And we start at 9:40 in this class. And if there are any other questions? I think the weight was 15%. So it is a serious weight. Okay, I'll see you on Friday.